The crimson glow of the setting sun blanketed the hills surrounding the ranch, stretching out like a fiery tapestry against the fading light. Lily leaned against the barn door, clutching an old camera that had long been abandoned. Her gaze was distant, fixed on the empty expanse before her. That camera had once been a part of her, a piece of who she was before she lost herself, and now, as it rested in her hands, it felt like a relic of forgotten dreams stirring back to life. Moonlight. The white horse with a coat that gleamed silver under the fading daylight stood silently in its stall. Its large dark eyes reflected the golden hues of dusk. Every so often it shifted, letting out soft, faint sounds as though to pull Lily back into the present. But her mind had wandered far. Caught in the labyrinth of old memories and emotions she could not quite name, a faint sound broke the stillness behind her. The soft creak of footsteps on woods. She turned sharply, her breath catching in her throat. "Who's there?" The wind answered her call, whistling through the cracks in the wooden beams, carrying with it the chill of the approaching night. As her heartbeat settled, her eyes adapted to the dim light, and she noticed him leaning casually against one of the wooden pillars. Her voice was trembling slightly, echoing in the quiet barn. His eyes were always on her, and he said, "Why are you still out here so late?" His voice was silky and low, with a hint of interest but also a hint of quiet worry. Bash always seemed to show up out of the blue, giving her the impression that he had been there the entire time. Silently observing, "I'm not sure," Lily said. "I guess I just wanted to be here for a while," with a faint smile that belied the weight of too many unspoken emotions. He stepped closer, his sharp, penetrating eyes seeming to look right through her. He said nothing, but the intensity of his gaze stripped away every shield she had carefully built. The silence between them was not awkward, it was charged heavily with the things neither of them dared to say aloud. "You still have that camera, Bash," he said abruptly, his eyes flicking to the weathered device in her hands. "It's like you're holding on to a piece of your past," he said, his words deliberate, each one brushing against a corner of her soul that she had long tried to hide. "Sometimes the past is all I have," Lily said, her voice soft but laden with emotion. "Everything else doesn't feel like mine anymore." Her words hung in the air, heavy with the ache of loss, like a scar healed on the surface but still tender underneath. Bash moved closer to the space between them, shrinking until only a breath separated them. "Then why don't you take back what you've lost?" he asked, his voice both a challenge and an invitation, daring her to break free from the invisible chains binding her. Before Lily could respond, the low rumble of a truck engine cut through the tension like a blade. They both turned their heads toward the sound, toward the dirt road leading to the ranch. Headlights pierced the growing darkness, casting long, shifting shadows against the barn walls. It was Caleb. His husband's familiar truck rolled slowly up the gravel path, its beams slicing through the stillness, illuminating the barn like an unwelcome spotlight. "He's home earlier than expected," Lily whispered, her voice barely audible and trembling with a mixture of fear and anticipation. Bash said nothing, but his expression darkened, his posture stiffening. Caleb never returned unannounced, and this sudden arrival carried a sense of foreboding that neither of them could ignore. For a moment time seemed to halt. Lily's grip on the camera faltered, and it slid slightly in her hands, suddenly feeling heavier than ever. She could feel her pulse quickened as Caleb's truck came to a stop, the engine from shutting off with an ominous finality. The barn door creaked loudly on its hinges as Caleb pushed it open. The beam of his flashlight cut through the dim space, sweeping over the stalls before landing squarely on Lily's face. "Still out here?" Caleb's voice was calm, almost casual, but to Lily it carried the weight of an unspoken accusation. She took a step back instinctively, her eyes darting toward Bash, but he remained still, his gaze unwavering. Caleb's arrival shattered the fragile sanctuary they had shared, leaving Lily standing in the middle of an unspoken storm. She could feel Bash's silent presence behind her, strong and steady, but his shoulders had tensed as if bracing for a blow. In that moment everything seemed to shift. Caleb's light lingered on her face, his expression unreadable, and Lily, with her heart pounding in her chest, realized that the life she had so carefully constructed, the secrets she had buried and the emotions she had tried to suppress, none of it could remain hidden any longer. Lily sat quietly on the wooden steps of the house, the pale moonlight spilling across the open fields like a silken veil in her hands. The old camera Bash had mentioned earlier rested heavily, as though it carried the weight of memories she had long buried. The gentle breeze rustled the dry grass and whispered through the trees, But her mind was elsewhere, drawn back to another time, another life she had left behind back then when she was young and full of passion. The world seemed limitless, brimming with opportunity. Lily had been a rising star in photography, known for capturing raw, unfiltered moments of nature and humanity. Her photographs didn't just showcase scenes, they etched emotions into the viewer's heart. The unspoken truths others often overlooked in her work had been displayed in prominent galleries, the golden light illuminating each carefully framed image. It was in one such gallery that she met Caleb. Caleb had been a young, ambitious man brimming with confidence and charisma. He had attended her exhibition, not only drawn by the art but also captivated by Lily herself. Purchased one of her most striking pieces, a photograph of an untamed field bathed in the dim glow of dusk. "It's like you," said, standing before the image, is beautiful, wild, and full of mystery. Those words had stirred something in Lily's heart. It wasn't long before their relationship bloomed into a whirlwind of passion. Caleb, with his steadfast determination, made Lily feel seen, cherished, and grounded in a way she hadn't known before. He convinced her to abandon the uncertainty of an artist's life to build a stable future with him. He painted vivid dreams of a big house, a serene ranch, and a life free from worry where their happiness would flourish uninterrupted. At the time, Lily had been young and brimming with faith and love. She agreed. She gave up everything, her career, her friends, and the bright lights of the art world. Moving to the ranch with Caleb felt like stepping into the promise of a new beginning. At first, everything was fresh and hopeful. She learned to care for the horses, to tend the flowers, and to immerse herself in the quiet calm Caleb had promised. But over time, Lily realized that calm was not the same as fulfillment. Caleb's work began to consume him, pulling him further away. His business ventures demanded more of his attention, leaving her alone in the vast silence of the ranch. The life she had imagined became a hollow echo of what she had hoped for, and she began to feel the weight of everything she had given up. And then there was Bash. Lily thought back to the first time she met him during her final years in college, when she was still that wide-eyed, fiery girl who believed in endless possibilities. Bash was a free-spirit artist, a man who lived for adventure and reveled in breaking boundaries. He often joked, life's just a giant canvas and the best art comes when you tear through the frame. Bash was the first person who made her feel truly untethered, unburdened by rules or expectations. The two of them shared wild, carefree days, camping in secluded places, chasing the perfect light for their photographs, capturing the world in its raw, unfiltered beauty. Bash was a fire, fierce and untamed, and just like fire, he couldn't stay in one place. When Lily chose the stability Caleb offered, Bash disappeared without a word. He left behind an emptiness in her heart, a lingering ache she had never admitted to, not even to herself. And now, years later, here he was again, walking back into her life with all the force of a storm, bringing with him the memories she had worked so hard to forget. Sitting there in the quiet of the night, Lily couldn't stop herself from wondering, had she made the right choice leaving behind her old life? Leaving a Bash, the stability she now lived in was safe, but it didn't bring her the happiness she had once believed it would. Clash with his untamed spirit and relentless freedom was a reminder of the person she had once been, a woman unafraid, unshackled by responsibility or obligation. The sound of hooves on the dirt outside the barn broke her reverie. She looked up, her gaze drawn to Moonlight, who stood patiently in the paddock, its large, curious eyes watching her as if asking what was on her mind. Slowly, Lily rose, walking toward the horse. When her hand rested on Moonlight's soft silken coat, a surge of emotion swept through her. Something within her was shifting, awakening, as though Bash's reappearance had blown away the dust that had settled over her soul. But deep down, Lily knew this change wouldn't come easily. Bash wasn't just a ghost from her past. He was a part of the person she had buried. And now his return wasn't merely a reminder. It was a challenge for her to face what she had lost and to decide once again what she truly wanted from her life. The golden hues of the setting sun stretched across the fields, casting a warm glow over the distant hills. Lily stood by the fence, her gaze following Moonlight as the horse galloped freely across the open paddock. The white horse seemed like a symbol of liberty, was something Lily had always longed for but never truly possessed. The sound of footsteps behind her pulled her from her wandering thoughts. Bash appeared, his usual air of calm confidence wrapped around him, though his eyes glimmered with quiet concern. He moved to stand beside her, leaning casually against the fence, his shoulder nearly brushing. "Why do you always watch Moonlight?" She turned to face Bash, her eyes distant but tinged with defiance, as if daring him to disagree. But Bash simply nodded. Bash asked in a low voice, steady but probing, as though he was reaching into a deeper part of her, It's like you see yourself in him." Lily gave a faint laugh. But it lacked warmth. "Perhaps because he has something I don't." Freedom. In a storm of emotions and thoughts she dared not name, Lily remained rooted to the spot left behind when Caleb called later that night to tell her he'd be staying in the city for a few more days due to an unexpected meeting. His words were like a blade slicing through the carefully constructed walls she had built around herself. "You don't have to live like this," Lily said in a voice that was rough yet resolute. "You don't have to keep yourself locked in a cage just because you think that's the only place you belong." She had become accustomed to him putting his work before everything else, including her. But tonight the house felt more empty than ever. The quiet rooms and the suffocating darkness seemed to swallow her whole. Unable to handle the stillness, Lily grabbed a sweater and went outside, drawn to the barn, the one place that felt more like home than the house ever did. Moonlight stood on his stool, his big dark eyes gleaming in the dim light as if greeting her. But this time she wasn't alone. Bash was there, standing close to a tiny oil lamp, carefully mending a broken bridle. He couldn't sleep, so he looked up when he saw her. Bash asked in a gentle but curious tone, "Do you always work this late, Lily?" Lily just shook her head and walked toward Moonlight, her hand gliding over the horse's silky coat. She wasn't sure why she had come here, but something inside of her made her do it. Shrugged his eyes, remaining on her for a second longer than usual. Asked her voice, light but tinged with nervousness. She was trying to steer the conversation away from the knot of feelings tightening inside her. "Bash, I like working when it's quiet. And you? Why do you like being out here at night?" Lily looked up, her eyes meeting his in a moment of unspoken understanding. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was charged, as if an invisible thread was pulling them closer. Closer. And setting the bridle down and took a slow step toward. She didn't move away, though she heart began to race, not from fear but from a feeling she couldn't control. "You don't deserve to feel this lonely," Bash said, his voice low and steady as though he was afraid to disturb the fragile moment between them. "You deserve so much more." Lily felt her breath catch. His words reached into a part of her that Caleb had never touched. She wanted to argue, to tell him that everything was fine, that she was fine, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she found herself leaning toward him as if it was no longer a choice but an inevitability. In that moment, Bash raised a hand, gently cupping her face. Lily closed her eyes, unable to stop herself. She knew she was crossing a line she wasn't sure she could ever step back over, but with the warmth of his hand on her skin and the intensity in his gaze, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. She felt seen, understood, and for the first time in what seemed like forever, alive. The kiss that followed wasn't planned or explained. It simply happened as naturally as breathing. It wasn't just a connection between two people. It was the breaking of chains that had bound her for too long. Lily didn't think about Caleb or the consequences. All she could think about was the undeniable truth that in that fleeting moment she felt like herself again. A sudden noise in the distance shattered the fragile stillness, pulling them both back to reality. Lily jerked away, her eyes wide with panic. Bash stepped back as well, though his eyes remained locked on hers, steady and reassuring. "Lily," he whispered, his voice soft, almost pleading. But she shook her head and turned, hurrying out of the barn without another word, leaving him behind in the suffocating tension of what they had just shared. As she ran back toward the house, her mind swirled with fear and confusion. She knew she had just stepped into dangerous territory, but at the same time she couldn't deny the spark that had been ignited within her, a fire she wasn't sure she wanted or could extinguish. Lily sat in the kitchen, her hand absent-mindedly stirring a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. The faint light from the overhead lamp did little to dispel the oppressive weight pressing down on her chest. Caleb had returned the night before, and from the moment he walked through the door something about him had shifted. Gone was the usual indifference, replaced by a quiet, scrutinizing presence, as if he were trying to see through her, searching for something she was desperate to keep hidden. "Is there something you want to tell me?" Ivy's voice pierced the quiet like a dagger, low and harsh. Lily recoiled as she raised her head to look into his eyes. His suitcase remained in his hand as he stood at the door, his tie a little rumpled, but his gaze never left her. "What are you saying?" Caleb walked forward slowly, setting his bag on the table with a hefty thud that made her jump. She inquired, trying to keep her voice calm even though she could feel her composure breaking. She understood precisely what he was driving at, the reality boiling just beneath the surface of his words. "Don't play dumb, Lily. You've changed lately." Always at the barn, always avoiding me, and then Bash. His name fell from Caleb's lips like an accusation. A dagger aimed straight at her. Lily felt the blood in her veins turn cold. What about Bash? She managed to ask, feigning ignorance. But the tremor in her voice betrayed her. She was losing control. Caleb leaned on the table, his hands pressing into the wood as he leaned closer. His eyes blazing with an anger she hadn't seen before. I hired a private investigator, Lily. I have pictures of you and Bash in the barn. His voice was low, menacing. Each word hammering down on her like the world collapsing around her. She shot to her feet. The chair screeching against the floor. You followed me, she shouted, her voice cracking under the weight of her fear. Caleb straightened, his expression cold and unyielding. I had every right. This is our marriage. Did you think I'd let you betray me without doing something about it? Her heart pounded so hard she thought it might burst. She couldn't form the words to defend herself, couldn't explain the truth. Was she had not betrayed him, not just in action but also in her heart, in the pieces of her soul she had long since disconnected from him. For years she had felt no connection to Caleb. No sense of partnership. But now, under the weight of his fury, she realized how far everything had spiraled out of control. A sudden knock at the door shattered the tension, making both of them jump. Caleb turned, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. He strode to the door and pulled it open to reveal Bash standing there. His expression calm but his eyes filled with determination. I need to talk to you, Bash said, his tone steady, though urgent, flickered beneath the surface. Caleb stared at Bash as though he were staring down his greatest enemy. You've got some nerve showing up here, Caleb spat, his voice laced with warning. But Bash stood his ground. I'm not here to argue, I'm here for Lily. The blood drained from Lily's face. She stood frozen, her gaze darting between Caleb and Bash, unable to fathom what was about to unfold. Caleb turned back to her, his expression darkening with every passing second. So it's true, he said, his voice low and venomous. You won't even deny it, will you? Enough? Caleb, Bash interjected, stepping inside before Caleb could block. He positioned himself between Caleb and Lily as if shielding her. You don't understand her. You've never truly seen her for who she is. She doesn't deserve this. Tears welled in Lily's eyes. But she refused to let them fall. She didn't want to appear weak. Not in front of these two men who seemed to be fighting over pieces of her that she wasn't even sure belonged to her anymore. Stop it, she said, her voice cracking. Both of you just stop. Neither of them listened. Caleb stepped closer to Bash, his face flushed with anger. You think you know her better than I do? Do you think you have any right to be here? To say this? Caleb's voice rose, the tension boiling over. Bash didn't flinch. I'm not here for rights. I'm here because she deserves to be happy. The room grew unbearably tense, as though a bomb were ticking down, waiting to explode. Lily stood in the middle of her heart, tearing itself apart between the weight of responsibility and the pull of desire, between the life she had built and the one she had buried. She didn't know what to do. But she knew that when this night ended, nothing would ever be the same again. Lily stood still in the barn, her trembling hands brushing over Moonlight's sleek coat. The familiar sense of wood, hay, and sweat lingered in the air. But now the atmosphere felt heavier than ever. Bash's final words still echoed in her mind, reverberating like a bell that refused to stop ringing. I'm here because you deserve to be happy. His words carried a raw sincerity, a force that swept away everything she thought she knew about herself. Caleb had left not in forgiveness, but in retreat. He couldn't bear to stay, couldn't stand to witness more. His parting glance was a mixture of anger and heartbreak, as though Lily had not only shattered his heart but also the carefully constructed image of the perfect wife he had tried to preserve for so many years before he left. He uttered one sentence, cold and sharp enough to freeze her in place. You have to decide your life from now on. The barn door creaked open, and Bash stepped inside, his footsteps soft but carrying a weight that was impossible to ignore. He didn't say anything at first, simply standing there, his deep, steady gaze fixed on her. It was as though he could see through all the layers she had desperately tried to build around herself. Are you okay? He finally asked, his voice low but full of quiet concern. Lily didn't answer right away. She turned to meet his eyes, realizing that he was waiting for something, a signal, a word, anything to show that she was ready to take a step toward him. But she wasn't sure. Everything inside her was tangled like a ball of yarn pulled too tightly in too many directions. I don't know, she whispered. Her voice was barely audible. I don't know what to do. Bash stepped closer. His movements were deliberate and unhurried. and his presence offered comfort without pressure. "You don't have to know right now," he said gently. "You just have to do what makes you feel like yourself. I'm not here to make you choose, I'm here because I want you to be happy." His words brought tears to Lily's eyes for the first time in years. She felt like she was allowed to be vulnerable, to be imperfect. Bash raised a hand but didn't touch her, leaving the choice entirely in her hands. She could decide whether she wanted him to stay. "Bash," Lily began, but the words faltered on her lips. She wasn't sure what to say next. I wasn't sure if she could give him what he was hoping for. She wasn't sure if she was ready to let go of everything she had once shared with Caleb, even though their relationship now felt like little more than fractured pieces of a long broken bond. Bash smiled faintly. A bittersweet smile filled with understanding. "I'll go," he said quietly, "but if you need me, I'll be here." He turned and walked slowly out of the barn, leaving Lily alone with moonlight and the whirlwind of thoughts in her mind. She stood there watching his figure disappears into the dim light outside. A part of her wanted to run after him to call him back, but another part of her held her in place, tethering her to the past like an invisible chain. She couldn't, at least not yet. That night Lily lay in her empty bedroom, staring at the ceiling outside. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the chill of something new beginning. She couldn't sleep, but she didn't want to close her eyes either. Everything had changed, and she wasn't sure if she had the courage to change with it. The next morning Caleb was gone. He left no goodbye, no explanations, only a set of keys and a small note on the kitchen table. "The ranch is yours." Lily picked up the note, feeling a strange mix of relief and emptiness settles in her chest. She stepped outside. The soft light of dawn spilling over the fields, painting the dewy grass in shades of gold. Moonlight stood in the paddock, his large eyes fixed on her as though he understood something she didn't. Lily grabbed her old camera and walked toward the horse. She lifted the camera, looking through the viewfinder, and for the first time in years she felt a flicker of something familiar, a spark of hope, a taste of freedom. She didn't know if she would ever go back to Bash. She didn't know if Caleb would ever forgive her. But in this moment she knew one thing: she had to start with herself, with whatever was left. The camera clicked softly as she took her first photo in years, and in that fleeting moment Lily felt like this might be the beginning of a new chapter, a chapter she would write on her own, even if it came with unanswered questions and uncertainties waiting to unfold.